The people who would have the wherewithal to remove Putin are most likely the nationalists, uh, because they're the ones who would be motivated in the present situation by something resembling an idea, and some type of concern for the future of the country.
So, David, when Vladimir Putin finally disappears, what do you think we can expect to see in Moscow or in the Kremlin? Do you think that we'll see anarchy? Will there be fighting? Or will there be silence as they try to figure out what to do next?
Well, I think everything depends on how he disappears, and history is a guide here. Uh, if he's removed in a palace coup the way Khrushchev was, there's likely to be no reaction at all. Uh, Remember, this is a very passive population, and they've been inculcated in passivity during the last 3+ years of war. They were pretty passive before that, but it's been especially important uh, for the regime to keep the population under control under these conditions, and they've done a pretty good job of it.
Hmm.
We know that there's a relative absence of public protest, even in areas in which the cost of the war has been horrific. Occasional protests over the number of people killed. If there is an unstable situation and one faction or another takes advantage of it uh, to move against Putin, it's possible that they will try to involve the population. Under those circumstances, uh, all bets are off. Uh, we don't really know uh, who will prevail in that situation, and what it is that they're going to advocate. But my guess is that if Putin is removed, it will be under circumstances in which not much will happen in Russian society. There'll be a new set of rulers who will then, of course, denounce Putin, expose all of his mistakes. And I think one of the things they'll begin with is the apartment bombings in order to secure their own legitimacy. And then they'll make changes. In what direction those changes will be, it's hard to predict. The people who would have the wherewithal to remove Putin are most likely the nationalists, uh, because they're the ones who would be motivated in the present situation by something resembling an idea, and some type of concern for the future of the country. Those people are anti-Western, but having assumed power, they'll be confronted with a situation in which a turn to the West is very much in Russia's advantage. So it's not out of the question that even these anti-Western elements and national chauvinists, if they took power and if they were successful in removing Putin, might understand that Russia's future depends on reestablishing its relationship with the West.
So, if we had something like this in Russia, don't you think it's very probable it could go a little bit differently? We know that there's major groups that are each other's necks. We have the military, we have the FSB, and within the FSB, various different groups that don't get along. But there's also different oligarchical groups, and some of them have their own private military companies. It goes on and on who could be against who and who's allied or not allied. But either way, if they were to seize power, one of these groups, we could be quite certain that they would then try to consolidate power, because it tends to be what they've done in history. Do you agree with that? But also, do you agree with the hypothesis that if somebody were to seize power tomorrow in a coup, it would probably end the war in Ukraine immediately? One of the arguments being this: ultimately, if you overthrow a government, you need to protect your government. The counter-revolutionary phase is the most dangerous part of a revolution. So having soldiers back in Moscow is something that you would want, assuming that they are loyal to you. Does that make sense? And what do you think would happen?
Well, the various oligarchic groups are not fighting over principle, they're fighting over money. And of course, money also means power. If the war begins to threaten the economic interest of one or another group, and that group begins to act to oppose the regime, they may de facto be acting in the interest of peace and in the interest of the country. But that's not the primary motivation. The motivation would be their own interests, in particular, their economic interest. Uh, for the moment, the only principled opposition, the only hints at principled opposition are coming from the nationalist right. It's interesting that General Ivashko has now again surfaced. We may remember who he is. He was the head of the uh, Retired Officers Association in Russia, who warned against an invasion of Ukraine and said it would be the death knell for Russia. All of his predictions, which were made in early 2022, have been proven to be accurate. And now, after a long period of silence, he's again appeared uh, in public, repeating his, what he said 3.5 years ago, that a war with Ukraine is nothing but a disaster, and that it will lead Russia to destruction. And he's received support, strange as it may seem, from Igor Girkin, who's a prisoner, who has confirmed in somewhat different language, but the essence of it is the same, that the present leadership is leading the country to destruction. Now, we can assume that the sentiments expressed by Girkin and Ivashko are shared by other people who are silent, but nonetheless hold high positions in the military and the security services, because those conclusions are based on a sober and realistic reading of the situation, and a concern which I have to believe is shared by at least some people for the future of Russia. This concern is not typical of Putin and his entourage, or for most of the oligarchs who amassed huge fortunes during the 90s and the 2000s. But there are people still left in Russia who care about the country. Those people are the only ones who would be motivated to do something out of patriotic concern. And it's possible that they would act, but they would need the support of those oligarchic elements who think that the war is ruining them financially and economically. And so potentially there are elements who could coalesce, could overthrow the regime, could call on the population, but all of this will depend, I think, ultimately on the progress of the war. We are now in a stage of a war of attrition, and the good news is that Ukrainian society is morally strong and understands the stakes. And the bad news is that that Russia is much bigger than Ukraine and has absolutely no concern about wasting human lives or resources. Under those circumstances, war is in many ways the ultimate test for a society. And it's insofar as Ukraine is fighting for Western values and a turn toward the West and a possibility of becoming a normal Western democratic country, this is also a test of us. If we can pass that test and show enough solidarity and inner strength to prevail in in a war of attrition, the internal forces in Russia uh, that that are capable of working against the Putin regime could be greatly strengthened, and we could see, even in the not too distant future, a crisis of the regime. But all of this depends on many factors, including how well we in the West can support Ukraine uh, in its unfair and uneven struggle with a much larger country.
So is that possible, though, that Russia abandons this imperialism that it's had for centuries? And for that matter, what would it be replaced by? It's always been nostalgia for the past and that Russia's great. But for that matter, there's something else in Russia which contributes to this, which is the inherent chauvinism associated with some of the cultural attributes. But there's something even more associated with that, which is the cruelty associated, the barbarity that we see to execute orders and to fulfill things. Do you think that this can change in Russian culture, or is this just part of the DNA? What is it that's necessary for Russia to change?
Well, I think that any country can change. This is the Russian tradition, but there are elements in the Russian tradition that opposed these tendencies. Even though the great writers of Russia have been quoted in order to justify Russian imperialism, there's also a tradition of humanism and concern for justice. The tradition that goes back to the Decembrists and their attempt to overthrow the Tsar and establish a constitutional system was continued in one form or another throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It was expressed through the actions of the Soviet dissidents, for example. It was expressed by the liberals in the Russian State Duma before the revolution. It's a tradition on which it's possible to draw. It's a minority tradition, but and of course we saw the democratic movement, most importantly during Perestroika, when an essentially peaceful democratic movement based on the desire for political rights overthrew a totalitarian regime. So it's not as if it's impossible. Of course, the default mentality of Russia is imperialist, cruel, and conformist. But that doesn't mean that it has to prevail in the future under the right and by the way, defeat in war has been an important positive factor in Russia's evolution. The defeat in the Crimean War led to the emancipation of the serfs. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War led to Russia's first constitution. Defeat in the Cold War led to the fall of the Soviet Union. The defeat in the Russia-Ukraine war could also be sufficiently important to open Russia up once and for all to Western influence. But first of all, it has to be defeated, and that will take, as we've said, it will take the efforts of the West as well as the efforts of Ukraine. And fortune has to smile on Russia, and the right people have to come to power. Russia has a very cursed history. At every point when it seemed that democratic development was possible, something terrible happened to derail it. Could happen in this case too, but in any case, an opening could definitely be created.
But do you think that the Russians today, looking at the situation, the guy on the street, does he realize how bad their situation's become? How acute it's become that today Russia is a pariah
From
state?
for Jason, from everything I've heard, and I've talked to people in Russia, he does not. That the atmosphere is not only normal, especially in the big cities, but there's even an impression of prosperity. A lot of people, even in the areas that are most affected by the war, that are providing the soldiers that are the location of the military factories. There's been an influx of money, and people are living better as a result of the war. Now, it could this kind of spending can't go on forever. And, if it leads to a massive crisis, economic crisis, those attitudes will change. But right now, I don't think that in terms of their economic situation, that Russians feel particularly disadvantaged by this war. Not yet, anyway. Now, that's one of the things that Ukraine has to do to win a war of attrition, is to make them feel that way, and the West as well. One of the reasons why sanctions can be very effective if they're sufficiently tough and if they're enforced. But for the time being, Russia has been able to hold on economically.
When you look at the elites in Russia, though, do you think in general they are nationalist, or do you think it's just transactional, that they're just there to promote their own interest? You said before it's largely the latter, that they're there to promote their own interest for wealth, for power, and things like that. But then what is it that motivates Russia today in its global plans? For instance, what we see in their alliances with Iran, with North Korea, with Hezbollah, with drug cartels, we see that Russia is engaged in all of this to advance its interest abroad. But I struggle to understand really what Russia's interests are abroad, other than being a thorn in the side of the West, in Latin America, as an example, or in Africa. What are they seeking to do?
Well, the the animating factor is to preserve the power of those who currently rule. That's the animating factor, and that means destabilizing the outside world, which lives according to law and recognized rules, because they cannot survive in an environment which is based on law and based on rules. And anything so therefore they're automatically the friend of all destabilizing forces. And insofar as the chief support of this small clique of criminals who rule in Russia is the traditional imperialist mentality of Russia, there's an additional incentive to back countries like Syria, the Assad regime in Syria, and other criminal regimes, the regime in Venezuela. Anything that can convince the public that Russia is a great power and that it has worldwide influence. But the overall motivation is to strengthen the hold on power of those who presently rule, and to undermine any forces, any influences that could make their rule untenable.
So at the end of the day, it's ultimately always about their own self-interest.
It's ultimately self-interest, and that's what's so horrifying. And that's and the Russians are very, very adept at manipulating Western so-called specialists and having them repeat this idea that Putin wants to be another Peter the Great, that he has all these great, that he's a Russian patriot. He wants to gather the Russian lands. I mean, all of this is propaganda to hide the fact that this is just that the real interest, that the real motivating factor here is criminal self-interest, and to serve that, Putin and the people around him are willing to sacrifice the lives of ordinary Russians without limit. And so in other words, there's if if Russian nationalism is evil and dangerous, but at least recognizable, the pursuit of criminal self-interest at the expense of hundreds of thousands or even millions of lives is represents a complete devaluation of human beings and of the value of human personality, and is not just evil but is radical evil. And this is a message that we in the West who are involved with this, the Ukraine also needs to get across, because we had our vice president in the United States made a statement early on. He didn't care who wins in Ukraine. It didn't Russia. It's all and President Trump has referred to the war as ridiculous. He thought something very trivial. He could, would never have happened had he been president. And Putin, of course, agreed. Could flatter his vanity. Said he can end it in one day. But it's important for their sake, for the sake of all of us, that we understand what the real stakes are here, and what the stakes are not just for Ukraine, but for everybody else. I mean, we're fortunate in the West that Ukraine is fighting so valiantly.
Donald Trump said that he would be able to end the war within a day. He seemed to think this would be quite easy. Vladimir Putin was being offered the vast majority of what he wanted. A lot of people say it's about 90% or more he was given. Lots of territories have been captured, and even some territories that had not yet been captured, he'd be able to keep. Yet, Putin walked on the deal. Why is that? Why do you think Vladimir Putin wasn't willing to make a deal with Donald Trump?
Well, I'm unaware that they agreed that they could have the territories that they hadn't captured. That as I understood the deal, they were going to freeze the situation at the line of contact.
At the
But
yeah.
I don't know. That was how it was my understanding. But in any case, what it was definitely tremendous concessions to Russia if they would stop fighting and just tear off a piece of Ukrainian territory and keep it. That discussion was a dead letter because it also, which and people haven't paid enough attention to this, implied some sort of enforcement on the Ukrainian side, some guarantees that the agreement would be observed, and that would involve foreign involvement. And we have to remember that when there was not a single foreign troop in Ukraine, or a single foreign rocket or military installation on Ukrainian territory, the Russian propaganda machine was working full time about the threat from NATO in Ukraine. So Putin was not going to accept an agreement in which a foreign military presence was accepted in Ukraine, and Russia formally accepted it, that Ukraine was allowed to remain as a formidable military power, which it did not appear to be in 2022 at the time when that massive propaganda campaign began. Now, of course, to some extent, it became so in the course of the war. The only way President Trump's whole approach was flawed because he approached this like a business negotiation, whereas in fact it's a struggle between two systems, two sets of values, two national futures, and the fundamental sense of Ukrainian national identity and its possible effect on Russia. The peace settlement that Trump was proposing would have left Ukraine with a powerful military, with foreign assistance in policing the ceasefire, and with a democratic system in which people, the country would be permanently oriented toward the West, and that example definitely would be destabilizing for Russia. At least it would be destabilizing for the Putin regime, because the democratic example of Ukraine would not have been destroyed. That's basically what's at stake here. If Russia can destroy Ukraine as an alternative democratic example for the Russian people, it can preserve its own the regime's own hold on power. If Ukraine continues, survives, and is powerful, prosperous, pro-Western, and backed up by Western forces, it will be a destabilizing influence for the Putin regime, not because it wants to be, but because it will underline so clearly by its example what's possible for the Russian people themselves. And that's why that was unacceptable. That was President Trump's fundamental misreading of the situation that led him to make that offer, and to put pressure on Ukraine, by the way. But the reality is that Russia can be forced to accept a great deal more than even what President Trump proposed, under circumstances in which the West is willing to exert pressure. I mean, real pressure that will cripple the Russian economy, that will harm the Western economies, because it's hard to do one without the other, but will nonetheless, ultimately, have a better chance of leading to a just result and put an end to the war of attrition.
So let me ask you just one last question. Let's imagine a hypothetical. If Russia wins
Sure.
in Ukraine, what would that mean? What would that entail? And what would that mean would happen next, including for the West?
Well, winning would mean that Ukraine, the line uh, cannot defend itself, that loses the ability to defend itself, and that Russian forces occupy large parts of Ukraine, dictate the conditions of the Ukrainian government, uh, possibly absorb some of the Ukrainian military into the Russian military, and threaten the West, because that would be the next step. Under those circumstances, they would be frozen into a situation of permanent hostility. They've already increased their war production to the maximum, but it'll be very difficult uh, to convert from a war economy under conditions of a Russian victory, in which Russia is faced with a hostile West, which is rearming, which it will be obliged to do
Hmm.
in the event of a Russian victory. Within that rearmament will spur, further intensification of the Russian military of mobilization. And we already have a preview with the overflights of and the drone incursions in European countries, the acts of sabotage, the planned assassinations. All of that will be greatly increased, and the pressure on Estonia, which is far less, and the Baltic republics, which are far less defensible than Ukraine, under conditions in which the powerful Ukrainian army is taken out of the picture, will be greatly increased and enforced and require massive rearmament and redeployment by NATO and the West. So logically, we should be devoting every available resource to helping Ukraine to win. I think it's a very sad commentary that on the state of Western society, that Russian disinformation has been as successful as it has been, and that it has crippled our response, what is in fact a threat to our security, as well as to the security of Ukraine.
Absolutely. David, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.